humanity ends.
Our minds are merging, Doctor. Our minds are one. I feel what you feel. I know what you know.
All right. Great stuff. Thank you. A great experience working at Star Trek. And now we get to bring him in. Eric Peters is with us. Eric, welcome. I hope your bunker is nice and cozy warm. And I really appreciate you being here, man. You have been doing double duty on so many shows, and there's been so much breaking news. Thanks for coming. How you doing?
Oh, absolutely. I'm in the state of Plaque Town now. Remember that?
Yeah.
I love to get the Star Trek references in whenever I can.
Oh, it is. It's just great. It is. It's really interesting the way, because they have necessity to build story drama, they create these instances in the show where it's like, well, we need something that'll bring some conflict or something that'll be some tradition or something. And then it becomes part of the lore. So, 50 years later, people remember these things. It's wild.
Because, we sit in front of the TV as kids watching this stuff over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's funny. Like I said, when I was a kid, I dreamt that I was on the bridge of the Enterprise and everything was sort of plush and was sort of like this raspberry sherbet color. And then when I went into Jerry Taylor's office the first day at Star Trek Voyager, I walked in and it wasn't it wasn't like the bridge of the Enterprise or the Voyager, but her furniture was that color. And so was the carpeting. And I was like, it was totally deja vu. I mean, I was like 8 years old when I had that dream. And I was like, wow. And I even told Jerry, it's like, Jerry, this is really weird. She's like, what? I was like, I dreamt something like this when I was 8 years old. She's like, wow, that's really strange. So, hey, man, listen, this is very interesting. I'm so glad that you're here, Eric, because I saw this story and I saw it on one of those little video captions where Donald Trump was there with Duffy, Sean Puffy Duffy Combs, and Duffy was all, buttering him up and had to wipe his brown nose off and stuff at the end of the day. But they're talking about these changes of regulations. And I sat there and I said, there's something kind of weird going on here, because I was trying to distinguish between whether they were going to allow them to be built. And I'm like, they can already build them. It's whether they can sell them. And this is what you brought up in your article. And so I want to turn to that right now. The Helix Champ coming to America. They come into America today. And there they are. There's the brown nose moment. They're all surrounded. They just think everything's so awesome. And tell us a little bit, because you have spoken about this, how we could get these really small cars, but the regulations don't allow them to be sold. So what are we looking at that changed under this magical edict of Donald Trump? And you've got some of this information here. As you say, Donald Trump appeared to say that Americans are going to be allowed, isn't it, to buy small, inexpensive vehicles. Tell me a little bit more about that, Eric.
Well, that's just the thing. It's difficult to know exactly what is going to happen. I try to pay close attention to language. So one of the things that Trump was talking about was that he's going to issue some sort of an executive decree via Sean Duffy that will enable manufacturers to produce, that was the word he used, vehicles like the Hilux Champ. And also, if you're familiar with, and I'm going to mispronounce it for some reason, I have difficulty with this word, but in Japan, there's a class of vehicles called Kia, not like Kia, the car company, but KEI. And it refers to a class of very small little cars that are abundant in Japan. And they don't sell them here. They don't sell the Hilux, which is a little pickup in this country. And the issue isn't whether they can produce them here. The issue is, will they be able to sell them here?
Right.
Now, they don't. The reason that chiefly that they don't sell them here now is because they do not comply with federal motor vehicle safety standards. It doesn't mean that they're unsafe. It just means that they're not fully compliant with every jot and tittle of the federal motor vehicle safety standards rigmarole. Exactly. So, for example, a vehicle that, let's say, has only 2 airbags, doesn't have side impact airbags, is that an unsafe car? I don't think it is. It's just not compliant. Or, maybe its roof doesn't adhere to federal crush standards. Okay, well, if you roll it, maybe it's going to crush. I don't know that that means it's unsafe. The point is that unless the requirements are either dispensed with or altered profoundly, those vehicles aren't going to be legal to sell here. A good way to understand this is right now you can buy, there's a little Jeep looking thing that is made by an Indian company called Mahindra that acquired the tooling and rights to the original Willys Jeep, the World War II era Jeep. And you can buy that right now. It's legal to buy it in this country. The problem is it's not legal for use on public roads, i.e. the government's roads. Same thing, people might be more familiar with the side-by-sides. Like if you go to a motorcycle store, they have these things called, like Can-Ams.
Right.
They're kind of like dune buggies, sort of.
Yeah,
in my
really
area
cool.
in the country, a lot of people buy these things because they've got land, and you can take them out in the field and have a lot of fun with them. But you can't register them and get plates for them and drive them on public roads. It's not legal to do that because they don't have airbags and all the other things. So, I'm wondering what exactly Trump means by all of this. Is it just more smoke and mirrors to make it sound like that these vehicles are going to be available here? And then as far as producing them, well, there's a reason they don't produce them here. It's too expensive.
Exactly.
Why would Toyota or any other manufacturer decide to pick up sticks and go from a place where they can manufacture these things inexpensively, come all the way over here, invest a ton of money in physical infrastructure to build a plant to produce these vehicles that are going to wind up costing so much that they lose any competitive advantage? The whole point is they're cheap. You're buying a little car, right? And what you're wanting there is to save some money. So if you can buy like a little Kia car for, say, $10,000 or $12,000 in an export market, and you're willing to do that because, hey, it's little, but it's cheap. Well, all of a sudden, if that car costs $23,000 or $24,000, well, why not just get a Hyundai Elantra, or something a little bit bigger? It doesn't make sense anymore. Is the point that I'm trying to make. So I just don't see this as altering anything. And also, macro view. The Department of Transportation, Sean Duffy was standing right there, the big federal regulatory apparatus, the DOT and NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which has de facto legislative power because they issue these regulations that have the force of law. They haven't been gotten rid of.
No, exactly. Exactly.
I mean, does it just mean, they're just going to ignore all of their own bureaucratic requirements and say, sure, go ahead, sell these things. We don't care. I don't buy it. I don't think it's going to mean anything. I don't think we're going to see these vehicles here. And even if we did, how does it make sense for Toyota to take one of their little cars and somehow re-engineer it to have 4 or even 6 airbags and all of the other things that it would have to be in this country? And by the time they do that, all of a sudden, it's at least as expensive as anything we're already, that's already on the market here.
That's what I was mentioning last night, Eric, because I was going through some of this information. I said, look, these little cars, they would have to re-engineer these things to accept all of the airbag regulations and all of the burdens that have been put on the auto industry already. And then something I didn't mention last night is there is the already existing years of tarnish, of layer of sediment, of government protections for the American auto industry, which led to the unions getting all sorts of agreements from the auto manufacturers like GM and so on that bring up tons and tons of expenses if you're going to try to build something in the United States. That's one of the other problems, which is it's the legacy of protectionism already from the 1970s on that saw these unions, and they were already given a lot of power during FDR's era. You're going to have to work in a union house. They had that for decades. But then when they got the tariffs against foreign cars, that gave those unions a lot more room to move to say, okay, now you can give us lots of gimmies because you got protection against the foreigners. So give us better retirement, give us better health care. We want an increase per hour. So those burdens are still on GM and Ford and so on. And they hit GM a few years ago. GM was saying, well, if we can give you an early buyout, that'll help us out a lot and we won't have to declare bankruptcy. So it's amazing to see how all these impediments are there, and we still don't even know what's going to be happening with these smaller cars. It would be great if they could make them here in the United States, but will they have to put all these airbags in? Will they even have room for them? As you say, in order to be able to drive on the roads, you put it in your article. You said the government-run roads require these government-run roads. It would be absurd to produce a vehicle meant for use on public roads that can't be used on public roads because it couldn't be sold in numbers high enough to make it worth trying to sell them. It's fine to buy a Roxor or side by side if you have a farm or enough land to knock around on and enough money to buy a fun toy to play in the field. Most people have neither. They need a vehicle they can drive on the government's public roads, but the government doesn't allow it. Right. And this is a very, very important thing to bring up. Now, let me ask you, Eric, I know that at the meeting, they mentioned that they were going to be rolling back some of these Biden era requirements by 2031, that cars had to get, that the CAFE standard had to be 50 plus miles per gallon for the CAFE standards. Can we go a little bit into what the CAFE standards mean for an entire line? And also something that I maybe had a misapprehension on this, because as I did some research, I'll show you what I posted over on the news notes yesterday, because I was talking about this, and I referred to some of this yesterday. I posted the link to your story, and I wrote about how I just basically said, Trump announced he approves the production of an ultra compact car / truck, whatever they're going to be possibly building, which wasn't previously allowed in America due to government regulations. But it really was allowed. It's just that it wasn't worth them building it here because they couldn't sell it here. They'd be shipping it and be extra expensive. Why not open a plant in Korea instead, where you can sell it? So the trick here has been that the unconstitutional and immoral so-called standards have been applied to things like safety and the CAFE standards. Yeah. So I was mentioning how on the CAFE standard side of things, I happen to mention that the corporate average fuel economy standards, this evidently is part of the executive action, which he can do because the executive branch controls so much of our lives. They don't want to, Biden didn't want to enter the market and say, hey, I'm going to build a car that'll get 50 miles per the gallon and I'll give it to you. And the only way I could do it is to make it essentially a hybrid or electric. He didn't do that. He said, I'm going to make you who are making cars do that. And you who are buying it have to buy them. But so evidently, as I mentioned here, they're going to roll it back to 34.5 miles per gallon instead of the 50.4 by 2031. And what I don't understand, though, is I got the impression that the CAFE standards were across a whole line. Mm-hmm. So that, like, for example, back in the 70s, when they applied the CAFE standards, we saw the smaller cars, when they said, you got to get better gas mileage, they knew that they were still selling things that were popular for truck people, pickup trucks, and they needed to be heavy and worthwhile. So they made the smaller cars even lighter. They became more dangerous, and more people were killed right after they had the CAFE standards increase. So I remember that when I was a kid, but I thought it was because they averaged it out for the whole fleet. Am I wrong to think that maybe I was incorrect in that thought, and it actually applies to certain sizes of cars separately, or am I? Can you explain that?
Yeah, let's start though with something that's important to understand.
Yeah.
The rolling back is no such thing. The current CAFE standard is about 35 miles per gallon. It's more smoke and mirrors. What Biden did was to decree, as you said, that it would rise to 50 miles per gallon by 2030.
Right.
But all Trump did basically is a holding action to say we're going to keep it where it was in 2020.
Right.
Where it is now. So they're not rolling back anything, and certainly not questioning fundamentally whether the government should be involved in this at all. 50-something years now, the government has been decreeing how many miles per gallon a given vehicle must get. And to get to your question, the fleet average, the term CAFE, corporate average fuel economy, means they factor out the mileage achieved by each model within the hierarchy. Given model, like a manufacturer like Toyota manufactures a number of vehicles, and they calculate the CAFE average based on the combined city highway averages, and that ends up being a certain number. Now, initially, they did used to have two separate categories. They used to say that there was a category for what they called passenger vehicles and then light trucks. And that was done kind of for the reason that you said, in that it was understood that, light trucks are a fundamentally different type of vehicle, meaning, an F-150 pickup, let's say.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Because at the time, in the 70s, when CAFE first came online, pretty much the only people who drove F-150s and vehicles like that were people who needed to drive them.
Yeah.
Those are
Farmers
trucks. You're,
baling hay
you're a
or
farmer,
yeah.
you're a contractor, you need a heavy duty vehicle like that. Of
Right.
course, now, these vehicles are used as daily drivers by a lot of people. And one of the reasons for that, ironically enough, is because of CAFE, because CAFE downsized cars to such an extent that people didn't like them anymore. They were too small to be useful. When you and I were kids, big sedans could handle 6 people and they had a big trunk, so they were fine for a family. Now, you get into a Camry, and I like the Camry. It's a nice car, but realistically, it's a 4-passenger car. I mean, you could put 5 people in it. It's going to be tight. It has a small trunk. It's a front-wheel drive based car, so it's really light duty. It's not very capable of doing things like pulling a trailer, which you could with the big V8 powered rear-wheel drive sedans and station wagons that were once very common when you and I were kids.
Right.
So what ended up happening, because of that so-called loophole with the light trucks, the manufacturers began building not only more trucks and SUVs, which are based on trucks, but making them nicer and nicer and nicer, more opulent, more comfortable even than cars, because it was understood that these things, wink, wink, are now the vehicles that people want to drive. Effectively, a current half-ton truck, something like a Ford F-150, is the equivalent of a big sedan, like the ones that, we saw abundantly when we were kids.
Right. Right.
So it's created all these bizarre and perverse incentives. Now, they have apparently rejiggered things a little bit. Now CAFE has to do with wheelbases and height. Again, it's about the government picking categories and defining how this is all going to be done. And Trump has done absolutely nothing to change the thing that is, in my opinion, the fundamental problem, which is based on a fatuity, which is this whole business of having the government decree mileage standards. The market will take care of this. If high fuel economy vehicles are desired by enough people, and they are, there's a market for that, a legitimate market, the manufacturers will provide high mileage vehicles for that segment of the market. But at the same time, there's also a market for vehicles that maybe don't get such great gas mileage, but they're large and they're comfortable and they're powerful. And some people are willing to pay extra for that, not just for the vehicle, but for the gas. My point being that market forces sort this out naturally. And you'd have a diversity of offerings, kind of like when you and I were kids. I mean, the whole gamut. You had cars like Volkswagen Beetles that weighed 1,600 pounds over here. And then you had, 4,000 pound plus big American dreadnought sedans for people who wanted that. And there was everything in between that. So whatever you wanted or needed, it was available. Now, thanks to CAFE and other federal regulations, what we're ending up with is basically, the one size fits all model. All vehicles are increasingly the same. And we're all paying for this, by the way. The government loves to prattle on about how much they're saving you with CAFE. They'll post numbers like, you're going to save X amount of dollars over so many years because we raised the fuel economy mandate by 5 miles per gallon, let's say. What they don't tell you is that in order for the vehicle manufacturer to comply with that, they've had to do things like add hybrid drivetrains, or gas direct injection with a separate port fuel injection circuit. They've had to add transmissions that now have 7, 8, 9, 10 speeds with multiple overdrive gears, all sorts of technical things that have been done to squeeze and eke out a little bit more gas mileage. That doesn't come free. You're paying a lot more for it. Cars have gotten, as everybody knows, much more expensive in real terms. It's not just inflation than they have ever been before. And part of the reason for that is the compliance costs that are baked in to the vehicle. But most people don't see that. You see the window sticker and you see what the price is. I've been telling, off the record and on the down low, people that I know in the business, you guys should really think about putting compliance costs as a line item on your window stickers. You should let people know exactly what they're paying for. Like, this is, your vehicle costs X dollars because of and, enumerate it, spell it out for them. And that would counter the propaganda that the government puts out about how much money they're saving you by forcing the manufacturers to adhere to a CAFE standard.
Eric, it's very interesting because last night I brought up, I said, it seemed like the CAFE standards, because they were tilting things more towards trying to attract people to the larger vehicles, that they were making up for CAFE standards by trying to bring in hybrids and electric vehicles and things like that. And now I'm thinking, evidently they've got this new thing, and I'm not exactly familiar with it, but you mentioned the wheelbase and the size. So they have different slots for CAFE standards for different wheelbases and size.
Yep.
And even that was something that was precluding the construction because it was precluding the sale of the smaller vehicles as well, unless, again, they were hybrids or EVs. And I also found out that the Biden administration was giving a special incentive for EVs, and that's one of the positive things. Yeah, so evidently, it has here that they had a let me see, they had a gas an EV incentive for producers. They artificially propped up EV sales by giving fuel efficiency credits for EV producers, such as Tesla.
Well, what they did was to come up with this new term called MPGE, little e after MPG. To understand this, when you look at the window sticker of a conventional car, a non-electric car, it'll tell you this vehicle gets X mileage, city, highway, and average. And, let's say it's 35 miles per gallon. With an electric vehicle, they came up with this very dishonest formula for calculating what they would call miles per gallon equivalent, E.
Right. Yeah.
And what it did was it enabled them to put on the window sticker, if you look at an EV window sticker, it'll typically say something like, 70 or 80 or even 100 MPGE. Sounds spectacular, right? It implies that you're getting the equivalent of 60, 70 miles per gallon in an electric vehicle, which you're not. But what it did, the math, obviously just averages. If you can calculate your fleet average with a vehicle that gets 100 MPGE and fold that in with your other vehicle that maybe gets 35, well, the average is going to be higher, right? It's going to look good for you from a regulatory compliance point of view. And that was an incentive that was put out there to make the manufacturers want to produce more of these EVs because it helped to improve their overall CAFE average, which helped them with compliance. And the thing is, they had to do that because if you don't comply, you get hit with these fines.
Right.
Fines. And of course, again, the average person doesn't understand this. The fines are folded into the cost of the vehicle. And I, once again, I've told the people that I know in the business, you guys should line item that. Put on the sticker, CAFE quote gas guzzler. That's what they call it. The gas guzzler fine or whatever. Put that on there. So people understand and recognize what's being done to them by the government that many of them foolishly believe is benevolent.
Isn't it interesting, Eric? Our guest is Eric Peters of ericpetersautos.com, everybody. We'll show you more of the website in a minute. Follow him on X. Apostate, is it 3? I can't remember. Apostate.
Oh, I don't even know. It's just kind
Eric
of something.
the Apostate, yes. And it is interesting. Isn't it amazing how the First Amendment rights that the Congress shall write no law abridging the freedom of speech, they die. They tend to not make it out of the desert there when it's, say, a gas station wanting to put up what the actual tax amount is, because you can't do that, and which got us to the I did that Joe Biden bumper stickers. And I do think it's also a real big commentary that you and I are talking about all this minutiae about how the government is telling people, well, you can do this, but you can't do that. And it could change. Like you were saying, what's happening isn't really a change now. It's just that they're saying by 2030, 2031, you won't have to be up to the 50.4 miles per gallon.
Well, even that is a gigantic maybe, assuming that Trump doesn't declare himself emperor for life, right?
Exactly.
So at some point, there's going to be a new president, and it very likely will be somebody who has a different ideological agenda, and who may reverse everything. So think about the chaos that imparts to the car business and to any other business. These people can't make rational business decisions about the future because they don't know what the future is going to be. Particularly in an industry like the car industry, where you're talking about a long lead time. If they're going to be making a vehicle by, let's say, 2029 or 30. They're planning that right now. They have to prove the design out. They have to do all this stuff before it's actually available to you in a dealer. So it's a long-term project. They can't just wheel around, and turn on a dime and change everything. And if they do, then what happens to all the money that they invested in what they thought was going to be what they were allowed to build? I mean, that's what's happening with this EV stuff. Look, the EV stuff was really hard pushed by the government during the Biden years.
Yeah.
So the manufacturers, they all bought into this because they thought, well, we got to do this. This is the environment in which we're going to have to operate. So we're going to commit to all these battery plants. We're going to commit to making all these EVs. Well, now Trump is in there, and Trump gets rid of the $7,500 tax kickback. He changes the cafe regs, all of these things, which have, and again, I'm not saying that those are bad things, but I'm just pointing out that it has been catastrophic for the manufacturers that threw all their money into this EV thing. Now they get to hold the bag for the losses, which means you and me, somebody's going to pay for that, right? And it's going to be it's going to be us in the long term.
Yeah,
so,
and go ahead.
So I'm going to say, so the same thing might happen again. Now Trump says, "Oh, great, go ahead and build larger vehicles again, bigger engines again, bring in these small cars that don't have airbags and so on and so forth." Well, come 2028, maybe we end up with Pete Buttigieg as president or Gavin Newsom, and all of a sudden he says, "No, we're going to go back to the way things were." Not only that, we're going to go even more hardcore in the other direction, because again, the regulatory bureaucracies have not been gotten rid of; they still exist. So
yeah. Well, I was going to say that's the problem. Oftentimes I try to say, what's the lesson out of this? It's like having a neighbor who's trained his dog to attack you. It's attacked you numerous times, so you've changed your behavior, and now he's got it on a leash, and he's saying everything's fine now, everything's totally cool. Or somebody else has the dog, and it's like, oh, I won't sick it on you. The dog's still there. And exactly. So the lesson, and this goes towards, well, maybe if they just conform to the Constitution. Well, the Constitution was there before they brought this stuff in. So maybe this is a lesson to tell people that even the Constitution didn't stop this from happening. Yep. And that's a lesson about the very creation of the state. Even when they promise you that, well, we're going to take away a bunch of your rights to make this entity, and you don't have a choice. But we promise beyond that, it's only going to do this. Well, clearly, the first injury of them assuming they can take your stuff means that the mindset is that they can just do this, and other people come in, and then they don't even care about the standards. And the problem that you bring up, that was basically the second thing that entered my mind, was the factories and how these things can't be that elastic. They're not as elastic as people think. There's a certain amount. One of the big points that Robert Higgs brought up when I first read his economic writing was about regime uncertainty during the FDR era, and how they did he did studies about people who own businesses, and they were unwilling to enter the market because they were unsure about how FDR would be as far as taxes and handing money to special favors. They're like, I'm just going to wait till he's out of there, right? Yeah, right. And in a way, I think it also goes towards regime rigidity, because you get certain people who lock into the changes, and now there are going to be new changes. And like you say, they can't be that elastic. They can't say, well, you know what we'll do? Yeah, we'll change now that they're giving a tax incentive for us to bring in the KEI cars, the K cars, or Kia cars, or whatever. We'll change that. Yeah. What's that?
It's hard to pronounce that word for some reason.
Yeah, right. But evidently they are going to be.
In her novel, Atlas Shrugged, she describes the business environment in that world. And that's exactly what we've got right now. There's a reason why things aren't working anymore. There's no incentive for them to work.
Yeah.
Right. Think about put it on a personal level. If you had a significant sum of money, let's say it was your life savings, are you going to invest it in a business that you think may not be allowed in 2 years, that the government might just shut down?
That's exactly it. And this is, every time they do something like this, I try to put myself in the place of a guy who's plunked down money and then had to change stuff already. And then you hear this, you're like, you know what, dude, let's just go someplace where we know they don't mess with people so much. Sure. And that's essentially what we're seeing. And they want to try to get these people to invest in it by starting up with this. I had something here. There's this tax break that Trump wants to. Oh yeah, here it is. They've got an immediate directive for the Department of Transportation and the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration to propose rule changes within 30 days. The finalized rules are supposed to be expected by mid-2026. I don't know why they're supposed to have the rule changes within 30 days, but they're going to finalize them by 2026. I don't know. They're going to propose them soon, but they want to finalize it by mid-year for the next year's model cars. And they want to approve for the key style cars targeted to begin as late as 2026 to begin construction. But the way they're going to do it, exactly what we're talking about. They want to incentivize it for domestic manufacturing with tax credits to change their assembly plants.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. So,
and by the way, none of the domestic manufacturers manufacture those cars. So you're talking about wholesale redesign from the ground up, unless they're going to partner with companies that already make them, which maybe they'll do. Maybe they'll talk to Toyota and Honda and Suzuki and figure. Remember back in the day when there was Geo from Chevy and Geo,
right.
They did that. That sort of a thing could be conceivable, but then it becomes a problem, I guess, in Trump world, because those are still Japanese cars being brought in here. And they're going to be subject to tariffs. So, I just don't see Ford or GM committing the vast resources that it would take to design from the ground up these little cars as a risky investment potentially, because who knows, their regulatory environment's going to change and then all of a sudden they're non-compliant and they can't sell them anymore.
Amazing. Eric,
but I will say this in defense of Trump, one thing, whether it was intentional or not, he brought to the national stage a topic that has not been discussed.
Sorry, you broke up there for me. I don't know how it was for the audience.
No, I'm hearing you perfectly well on my end. But I was going to say, whether intentionally or not, Trump did bring up that topic of the whole idea of the federal government saying what you're allowed to buy in terms of things like the Kia cars and also the mileage thing. And that might actually have some salutary long-term consequences, because people might finally understand, well, what is this all about? Why, because they just sort of take it as a given that what they see in the dealer is, that's the way it is. That's what they're, that's what they just get. They have no idea by and large what they're not getting and why, and maybe now they're beginning to look into it. I've been encouraging people for a long time to just, go online and have a look at what you can buy in other countries, including Europe, by the way. You can get all kinds of diesel-powered vehicles in Europe that are unavailable here.
We've spoken about that Volkswagen diesel, and I know Jason Barker. We were in the chat when you were chatting with David Knight. We were talking about the old Volkswagen Rabbit. What a great car that was, and the Volkswagen Beetle was even better than the Rabbit, in my opinion. Although the diesel Rabbit was pretty cool. We had a neighbor had a diesel Rabbit. He still has it. What I'm
saying is, like, right now, you can get like some of the models that are available in this country, made by Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen, that are only available in this country with gas engines. In Europe, you can get the identical vehicle with a diesel engine, that gets 45 or 50 miles per gallon.
Wow.
But we can't have those. And then, if you go across the border into Mexico, you wouldn't believe the vehicles that you can get over there. Little fun, little cute, just quirky, interesting vehicles. Same thing in Japan. There are abundant choices everywhere except here, where we've got this weird top-down command control economy. And here's another one that I wanted to bring up because I think it's very revelatory. I wrote an article a couple of days ago about an inexpensive little EV that you can get in Europe. It's made by a Swiss company called Micro. It's called the Microlina. And if you remember the BMW Isetta that was sold in Europe after the war, after World War II, with the front hinging, you got in by opening the front of it and sitting down. Anyway, this company makes an electric version of that car that's available in Europe, costs $16,000, which means that it costs roughly $8,000 less than anything new you can buy in this country. And we can't have it. Now, you think about it, they tell us that, this push to electrify everything is necessary. It's essential because we're facing this existential crisis. The climate is changing. It's imperative that we get people into these EVs and stop burning gas, right? That's the narrative.
Yeah.
Well, if that's true, wouldn't they do everything conceivable to encourage more people to get into electric vehicles, meaning make them more affordable and so more appealing? Why not bring these vehicles into the United States so that people could, instead of pushing these minimum on the low end, $40,000 EVs, that typically go for $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, why not let people have the option to get into a little $16,000 EV? So what if it doesn't have airbags? Aren't we all going to die and drown because of climate change?
I'd be curious to find out if I built my own car, I wouldn't be allowed to put it on the roads. They wouldn't allow me.
No, actually, you can do that. There are, in most states, there are exemptions for what do they call them? Maybe home builds. I can't. There's a term for it. You can do that, but most people don't have the mechanical know-how to build a kit car. Like for example, there are a couple of companies that offer kit versions of. Do you remember the old Lotus 7, the Caterham?
Those
are the prisoner drove.
Yeah, right.
You can get a kit to build one of those if you're handy. And you can build it, and once you build it yourself, then you can go and register it and drive it. But again, it's cumbersome. Most people, aren't able to put together a whole car themselves.
Right. And again, you still have to go through that final hoop of getting it registered and getting permission to put it on the roads. If it's not registered, then they'll get you,
Right.
which is amazing. Now, you mentioned something here, and you brought this up the other day with David. There are a couple things. First, one of the cars that I wish that I could get, and you and David were talking about it, the Miata.
Yeah.
Is there any further information about what might be happening for Mazda and the Miata? Because as you mentioned, it's possible that they might cancel the Miata.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a sad story. The Miata has been around since '89. The first model year was 1990, so that's a long time ago. It's been one of Mazda's most popular, best-selling models for all these decades, but it's not selling well anymore. And it's not because it's anything about the Miata is unwanted. It's they've done a very fine job of not really messing with the basic formula that they came up with all those years ago. I mean, they've tweaked it here and there, largely for the better. It's more powerful. It's got a 6-speed transmission now instead of a 5. But it now costs almost $30,000 to start. And, back in 89, 90, even into the 90s, most people could still afford to have 2 cars. So, they could afford to buy the fun car, the impractical car, which is what the Mazda Miata is. I mean, it's a little 2-seater with a small trunk. It's a great, fun car. But if you have kids, if you need a vehicle that has room for more than 2 people, you got to have something else, right? But you can't afford that something else anymore. So what people do now is they have the choice between the fun and the practical. They can only pick one. So they pick the practical. They don't buy the Miata. The Miata's too much. $30,000 for a toy. That's a bit high. Yeah. So, Mazda's got this big problem there. And, I think that maybe they could try to figure out a way to bring that price down substantially, and that would solve the problem. Unfortunately, the ugly rumor is they're talking about hybridizing it for compliance reasons.
Oh man.
And if you do that, well, it's a double tap, because first, it's going to make it even more expensive. You're adding additional components. It's going to make it heavier. It's going to make it less appealing to the kind of people who want an elemental, flickable, lightweight sports car. They don't want a big, heavy beast, which is what it would end up being. So, it's a shame. I would love to see them figure out a way to do things like, I don't know, I think the federal law requires now that they have to have at least 2 airbags, but why not skip the rest? The car comes with 4. Why not just figure out a way to remove those? Maybe figure out a way to do other things to bring the price down. Maybe get rid of the touchscreen. Maybe get rid of the air conditioning, power windows. It's a small little car. Make it simple. Make it a sports car, like they used to be. And if they could get the price down to $24,000 or $25,000 again, I think that the problem would solve itself. And I'd like to see them do that.
I would love to see it. I remember when they first came out and was around $13,000 or $14,000, and I used to see them there. I used to walk by when I was doing my journalism internship. There was somebody I lived on 4th Street Southeast, and I'd walk by this silver Miata every day, walking to and from, and I was like, oh man, that is such a cool car. I love that Miata. And it was a convertible. It was gorgeous, and I never got one, but I always wanted to get one. And as I mentioned, my brother had the RX-7, and that was really cool with that rotary engine. Sounded like a jet, and I just love that thing. It was great, and the torque on that was really cool. And I just thought Mazda made great cars. I had a Mazda 323, and it was a fantastic car. It was the best car I've ever owned. And I wish I could go back and, salvage it and save it and work on it a little bit more. But I'd love it if they could bring it down to $15,000, $20,000. Oh boy, that would be just terrific. But I don't know.
It bugs me. It makes me mad as well as sad to think that regular Americans, just middle-class people, I hate to use the Marxist term middle class. I don't like the class.
Yeah, I know.
My point is, just regular people are being pushed out of nice things, whether it's cars or single family homes. I'm not talking about, opulent, extravagant things. I'm talking about things that used to be givens for ordinary Americans to have a house, to have a fun car, even to have a boat potentially. Increasingly the middle class is being pushed into the working class in terms of what it's capable of having, and the working class is being pushed into complete serfdom.
Yes.
Eventually the middle class is going to be pushed into serfdom too. And you can see the trend. It's obvious. We're being, we're being converted in this country into something analogous to these third world countries that are, you've got the extremely affluent people at the very apex of this pyramid, and then underneath them is everybody else who's poor. There's nothing in the middle anymore.
I constantly think about that old British, the British enclosure movement, and they're doing it through regulations. They're doing it through the banking system. And of course, they're doing colonialism all over the world to get resources and land. And they're playing favorites with giant corporations in other countries. And they buy off politicians in those other countries. And as you know, if the big corporations get the money first from the Federal Reserve, they can spend it before the buying power has been diluted by going through the system and bidding up prices. So they get those assets right at the start. And then when the boom bust cycle runs its course, the bust comes, all these things that have been bid up in prices have to be sold at liquidated prices. Yep. So again, these people who have all the assets, they can go and they can take those commodities and get more liquid, turn liquid, and get some of these things at rock bottom prices. So they're gaining even more. Yep. It's really frustrating.
Well, and it's also necessarily authoritarian. You get to a point where you've enserfed the bulk of the population that lives in misery, and as a result is angry. Yeah. And, at that point, they're volatile. So they have to be kept in check. And the only way to do that is to have an authoritarian system to forcibly keep them in check. And that, too, is being erected all around us. This panopticon, all this stuff having to do with Palantir and the Genius Act and digitization of money, all of that is designed to control us ultimately when we get restless and we get frustrated.
Yeah, Eric, I don't know. Do you know whether the Miata do they have any construction inside the United States? Do you have any knowledge on that? I don't know.
The Miata, I think, is built exclusively at the plant in Hiroshima, Japan. I'm pretty sure it's Japanese made.
Wow. And I remember when they first came out with that, it wasn't exactly like it, but it sort of reminded me of one of the old MG designs, especially from the back. It sort of reminded me of an old MG.
Well, it was designed specifically to emulate the classic British sports cars.
Yeah.
In fact, I can't remember the guy's name, and I'm embarrassed that I can't remember his name, because as a car guy, I should know this, but he emulated the suspension, and I think he even worked on the suspension of Lotuses. To design the handling dynamics of the first generation car, and has kept true to that. The idea was to combine the soul of a British sports car, the emotional appeal, the fun, with Japanese build quality and reliability and durability. And they did that. The Miata, I love old MGs and, all those old British sports cars, but you had to really love them because they broke down a lot. They were finicky. They rusted out prematurely, all these things. Whereas the Miata, you can beat the living hell out of one of those things. You can take it to track days every weekend if you want to, and drive it to work all week. It's really hard to hurt them. You can drive them like that and put 200,000 plus miles on them before anything significant goes wrong with them.
I just love it. And even now I'm looking at the picture right there on the screen, Eric, and I'm just like, man, I wish I had one of those with that roll top. Man, that would be awesome. And it's interesting when you were talking with David, because you were talking about dune buggies and so on. And David was talking about dune buggies because he grew up near Daytona, and they would go out on the beach and bring their cars and stuff. And as you know, with my friends, they would take the old VWs and just take everything off. It would just be the frame and the engine. And then it was basically like a dune buggy. And, like I said, we had the throttle with the string. We'd be pulling the throttle with the string. And I was talking to my brother about that a little while ago. He goes, "Oh, I remember that." He goes, "That was fun, And, the engine wouldn't have any muffler or anything on it. It'd be super loud. It was like being in front of an airplane engine, Yeah,
but the zoomy pipe on the back, that stuck straight up. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It was great. And, we'd go over jumps and do all sorts of crazy stuff because you didn't have it was just the frame and the suspension. That was it, And that was fun. I really enjoyed that. But of course, it was on their land. And nowadays, I would be frustrated because I'd be sitting there saying like, "Oh, I'd want to, drive it from my friend's place over to my place. Maybe they'd let me drive it so I could get it over here to work on it. But I'd be worried that the cops would, come after me or something like that."
Well, sure. And think about I'm glad you brought up the Volkswagen again, because think about the fatuity of it. They made millions of those things.
Yeah.
They made millions of Pintos and cars like that, little small cars.
Yeah.
Was there like carnage all over the roads.
Right,
Back
right,
in the
yeah.
I mean, I drove those cars back in the day. You probably did too. One iteration or another of some little cheap, flimsy little car,
Yeah.
and we all lived. I mean, I
Yeah.
understand that there is some hypothetical risk in that. Okay, if you crash, in a small light car that doesn't have airbags, then yes, the risk that you might be injured or injured more severely is increased. But it has become pathological. It's become neurotic. It's become, just like a good analogy is this whole business with the masks. People are just cringing in fear, and they hear on CNN about the latest variant, and what do? They put their mask on because, oh my God, it's unsafe to go outside. We've created a culture of terror. It's absurd. When I was a kid, when I was in high school, before I was old enough to drive, I'd wait down at the bus stop. My buddy, his mom had a Beetle, and she would pick me up, and take me and my buddy to school in the Beetle with no airbags. Heaven forbid. I mean, today that would be considered almost child abuse. Oh my gosh, you put them into an unsafe car without air, and you weren't wearing seat belts either.
My dad, we had a Volkswagen Beetle with one of those. It was a very early sunroof, and as kids in Connecticut, my dad would start up the hill and he would coast down the hill because there was nobody on our road, and it wasn't a super steep hill. And we would stand on the top of the seats with our heads through the sunroof, and we'd be like, "Woo!" going down the street. It was
absolutely
so much fun.
You'd surf.
Yes, exactly. It was fantastic. And you mentioned the plotters and planners. We'll sort of finish with this, Eric, because I was thinking today about the term oligarchs, and in a way, I think what we've got is, instead of oligarchs, it's polygarchs. And from various sectors, they've gamed the system where they're locked in. Certain groups are locked in. You got the banking sector, you got the pharmaceutical sector, you got the military industrial sector. And it's not so much that it's a group of individuals that are the oligarchs. It's that these corporate entities that represent certain blocks of industry are the polygarchs. So there's more than one person who's on the board of that thing, but they themselves are helping to command and steer the so-called ship of state at our expense.
Well, this is the devilish aspect of it. It goes even deeper than that, I think. Everybody just about is, to one extent or another, embedded in it. I mean, think, for example, about Social Security. They have got whole generations of people invested by force in Social Security. So it's difficult for older people who are dependent now on that Social Security check to vote against their own interest, which are to get their check, right? Yeah. So they become clients of the government, and this is just one example of many, how they have managed to get almost all of us in some way or another dependent on or invested in this system, so that we wrestle with each other like a pack of hyenas, over the piece of meat that's thrown into the middle of the group.
And in a way, really, because government, and I mentioned this before, people keep telling you that government is there to protect your rights. And I constantly try to tell people, is like, look, if you're talking about, for example, we were talking about a man who was out in front of a building and he was preaching Christianity, and they said, you can't do that here. Same thing with, the FACE Act, of people who might be even just silently praying in front of abortion clinics or whatever. It's even worse over in England. And very interesting because, they'll silence people, but it's a public road. So I bring up the point, is like, they tell you that the government is there to protect your rights. But what it does is it chooses whose rights can be exercised when, because not everybody can do it within the tragedy of the commons, the public sphere.
Absolutely.
And yeah, and this is this is the thing that I think is so important, is once they take away that acknowledgement and respect for private property by creating the state in the first place, that's the moment that it's all done, because they're already saying, we're choosing for you that your rights are going to be taken from you. And then in all the areas that we're going to control, whether it's the police, people are going to argue, am I getting enough protection? Is it too much protection? How's that going to work? Is this justice system working properly? What about free speech? Well, it's a road. You can't protest on the road all day because people have to drive on it. But I thought I paid for it. So the whole thing is unmanageable. And it is very frustrating, because when they say that they're protecting us, they keep creating more and more of these protection rackets. And then the people with the biggest money are the ones who are going to make the racket work for them. And they become part of the oligarchy. Yeah,
that's very well said. Private property, whether it's literally in the form of our physical persons or things that we own, are the ultimate security and guarantor of our rights. So, for example, if you actually could own your own home, meaning you don't have to constantly pay the state or the county a tax to avoid being evicted from your house, i.e., the property tax.
Right.
That gives you an immense amount of freedom, and that protects your rights. You have your property, your land. The whole term of that old term about your home is your castle would literally be true if that were your property, where nobody without your permission could come onto your property or kick you out of your lawfully owned property.
Right.
Imagine that.
Yeah, that would be
that's what we need more of.
That's the dream, right? Let me hop over into Rumble and say hi to everybody. We've got wow, I see Birdhouse Blues is there from down in the Southwest. We've got Skunk Hollow over in Michigan. Let me see. Birdhouse says car requirements: Arizona, brakes, brake light, headlights, taillights, rear reflector, horn, muffler, rear view mirror, license plate, plate light, windshield or eye protection, seatbelts, tires, and insurance. And again, this is one of these things where the lesson that comes through is, what if I were to operate private roads? Because people seem to think that roads somehow only were created by government. And you and I have discussed this before. If roads can't be created privately, then how can I create the driveway to get from my garage to the road? Maybe the government has to create that too. How can I get to my front door? I must be too stupid.
Again, it's a total fortuity. I mean, think about, do you think people were stranded on their, on their homesteads? They're getting the majority of the secondary roads that exist in this country were once common rights of way. That people used to, ride their horses or their wagons and so on. They were taken over via eminent domain by the state, which then acquired operative control over them, which means de facto ownership. And they gaslight us by saying that, they're public roads. Yeah, well, it's the government that controls them, and he who controls the thing is the owner of the thing.
It's perfectly stated. Eric, thank you. This has been awesome. And I'm glad that we were able, and we'll see more as they come out with their proposals for the small vehicles and things like that. But it has been interesting to see. I think you're right. And I hope that people will remember things like Donald Trump saying, well, maybe the child doesn't need more than one doll. The child just can have, maybe they'll compare Donald Trump's position there and this new beneficent position of allowing more choices. And they might recognize maybe it's not cool to have anybody telling you what your choices can be.
That's my hope.
Yeah. All right, Eric. Thanks, man. Thank you. I'll tell everybody, check it out. He's Eric the Apostate on X, and he is an apostate of the space.
The space that he said we reach, man. Remember?
Yes. I love it. I love it. Sometime I'm going to have to get those Spock ears. I'm going to have to do that. That'll be cool. I don't know. Without any hair, can you imagine if I had like the Spock haircut? I'd look like I was in Devo. It would be crazy. Eric, thanks, man. Long live and prosper. Live long and prosper. Thank you, man. And say hi to the cats for me, okay, bro?
I will do. There's one sitting here right by my side.
All right, dude. Thanks, man. Talk to you later. We'll give Eric the outgoing farewell, as they say, for the Star Trek Vulcan mind meld. And
I must try to mind meld with it.
Eternity ends.
Our minds are merging, Doctor. Our minds are one. I feel what you feel. I know what you know.